Okay, great. So I'll get going and then refer to the handout at some point. So anyway, thanks for coming, everyone. The paper I'm going to present is part of a larger project on Kant's theory of judgment, and the focus, of course, is on practical judgment. Despite the centrality of the notion of judgment in Kant's critical philosophy, it has received far less attention in the practical philosophy than it has in both his theoretical philosophy and his aesthetics. Commentators who do discuss practical judgment focus usually on what I call the practical aspects of practical judgment. So issues like how to deal with moral dilemmas, conflicts of duties, hard cases, and so on. My aim here is slightly different. I'm interested in trying to understand the overall structure of the activity of practical judgment, which is to say the issue of what a practical judgment is. So just to kind of go over the structure of the talk. So in section 1, I'll start by presenting an overview of Kant's theory of judgment and highlighting some of the problems that I think arise in trying to make sense of practical judgment. I'll then turn in section 2 to a discussion of practical judgment in Honora O'Neill, and I'll raise some problems with her account. In section 3, where we'll spend most of our time, I'm going to present a new way of thinking about practical judgment. And then finally, section 4, I'll close by noting some of the implications and what I think are some upshots of my account. So let's dive in. Section 1. So the starting point, I think, for trying to understand what practical judgment is the faculty of mind that Kant calls the power of judgment, which is defined in the first critique as the faculty of subsuming under rules, that is, determining whether something stands under a given rule or not. Now, Kant thinks we need a distinct faculty of judgment because of a gap that exists between, on the one hand, the generality of rules, and on the other hand, the particularity of cases. And this is a gap, Kant thinks, that cannot be closed by rules themselves. So the task of discerning whether or not something is an instance of a rule cannot itself be governed by a rule on pain of regress. So this rule would require another rule, and so on to infinity. So something must end this regress if we're able to make judgments at all. And Kant calls this regress-ending thing the power of judgment. And he famously describes it as a special talent that cannot be taught, but only practiced. Now, in the third critique, the power of judgment is defined in a sort of similar way, perhaps more broadly, as the faculty for thinking the particular is contained under the universal. And here Kant makes a distinction that was in fact absent from the first critique between the determining and the reflecting uses of the power of judgment. So the distinction hinges on whether or not a universal is given. When a universal is given, Kant says the task of judgment is to subsume a particular under it, whereas when only the particular is given, one must search for or look for a universal for it. And I'll say a bit more shortly about the relationship between these two types of judgment.
Hey, Nick, sorry to interrupt. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We still don't have your handout. Raglan still doesn't have it.
Did you send it to me?
I emailed it.
Are you sure you pressed send? There we go. I think I got it. No, yeah, I got it. It just came. Okay.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. All right, so on the one hand, there's this distinction between the reflecting and the determining uses of the power of judgment. But in addition to this dichotomy, and this is sort of more clearly, I think, laid out on the handout, there is also a threefold distinction that Kant makes between different kinds of judgments, which he calls theoretical, practical, and aesthetic. And Kant thinks that we can distinguish these three types of judgments based on the faculty from which they originate and the norm or the principle governing it. So early on in the third critique, at the very end of the introductions, Kant provides this chart, and it's reconstructed on the handout, which maybe you now have. There you go. Great timing. So at the top of page 2, on the handout, and I've reconstructed this chart with perhaps a bit of taking some liberties, but hopefully it'll become clear what I'm getting at by the end of the talk. I just want to sort of highlight or flag a few things about this for now, so we can sort of ignore some aspects of this chart. So first, in the first column, Kant lists what he calls the three fundamental faculties. And in the second, he lists what he calls sub-faculties of cognition, or higher cognitive faculties. And he links each of these fundamental faculties with a higher cognitive faculty. And the link is sort of made via what comes in the third column, namely a principle. So he thinks that each higher cognitive faculty provides a principle for the fundamental faculty that it's paired with. You might notice that this is a threefold division that corresponds to the three critiques. But we're really only interested, as I say, in one of these pairings, namely the pairing of the higher cognitive faculty that he calls reason with the fundamental faculty that he calls desire. Kant defines desire as the faculty to be by means of one's representations the cause of the reality of the objects of these representations. And this is where Kant locates the will, which he defines as a faculty either of producing objects corresponding to representations or of determining itself to affect such objects. In other words, to have a will is to be able to bring about an object that I desire by representing it to myself prior to its existing. So whatever practical judgment is, we know that it is something that's governed by a law that's provided by reason for the will. But one of the challenges of practical judgment is that it seems to resist being easily understood as an instance of judgment in general, that is the thinking of a particular under a universal. Because unlike judgments that subsume a particular that is given under a concept or universal that may or may not also be given, practical judgment seems to start only with a given universal and seeks to bring about an object that is not yet given. So this productive dimension of practical judgment, I think, raises a number of questions. For example, are practical judgments determining or are they reflecting? Are they both? Are they neither? Does the fact that practical judgment deals with possible, which is to say not yet existing, actions, pose a problem for thinking about it in terms of applying a rule to a case or relatedly subsuming a particular under a universal? Can we even think of practical judgments in terms of the relationship between the universal and the particular? And if so, what would the relevant universal and particular be? So one of the few people who has discussed practical judgment in detail is Honora O'Neill. This is moving to section 2 of the paper. So O'Neill characterizes practical judgments as a matter of enacting or instantiating norms or principles, rather than describing the way the world is. However, she claims that this means that they can be neither determining nor reflecting, because both, she says, operate on the assumption that, quote, a particular aspect of the world is there to be judged, end quote. Or in Kant's terms, that a particular is given. But since practical judgment deals with a possible action, not an actual or existing one, O'Neill concludes that, quote, a particular, which is to exemplify the principle, does not yet exist and may never come to exist, end quote. So on the basis of this, she concludes that the determining reflecting distinction doesn't bear at all on the matter of practical judgment. She says neither is relevant to practical judgment. They have no role when no particular is given. So instead, she thinks practical judgment is this third kind of judgment for Kant that's neither determining nor reflecting. And so relatedly, she sees the notions of application and subsumption, as well as the notion of reflection, as irrelevant for thinking about practical judgment. There's nothing to apply a principle to, there's nothing to subsume under the principle, and there's nothing to reflect on. To be clear, we shouldn't take issue, I think, with the idea that in practical judgment, there's no action that exists. This is certainly what Kant thinks, this productive dimension, as I'm highlighting, of practical judgment is peculiar. My disagreement with O'Neill lies rather in what conclusions we should draw from this. So what I want to suggest is that we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss Kant's own way of speaking about judgment in general, and in particular, the case of practical judgment. So for one, I think that the determining reflecting distinction that he draws at least seems, the way he presents it, to be an exhaustive one, which is to say that all judgments must either be determining or reflecting. But also, when Kant speaks of practical judgment in the Typic section of the second critique, he uses terms that O'Neill herself rejects. So he describes practical judgment as a matter of determining whether an action possible for us in sensibility is or is not a case that stands under the rule. And thus he says it's the act by which what is said in the rule universally is applied to an action. And thus he says it's the subsumption of an action possible to me. So I think we have two options at this point. Either we could conclude with O'Neill that something that's a merely possible action is not a suitable candidate for being a particular, being subsumed under a universal. And so we just can't understand practical judgment in terms of the determining and reflecting distinction. And if we do this, I think we'd be committed to saying that Kant's own account of judgment lacks the resources in some sense needed to make sense of what at least one kind of judgment, namely practical judgment. And that these peculiarities of practical judgment require that we sort of abandon this particular kind of framework within Kant's theory of judgment in order to explain what it is. Alternatively, we could see this as an occasion for thinking further about what it might mean for a particular to be given and how practical judgment might be situated within Kant's overall account of judgment. So that's what I want to do for the rest of the talk. And then this will lead us into section 3. So what I'll argue is that practical judgment arises from the exercise of the power of judgment and the faculty of reason, working together or cooperating, you might say. And so what I'll argue is this actually makes them both determining and reflecting. So to do this, I'm going to start by saying a bit about both of these faculties so that I can spell out after this why I think that the kinds of judgments that they jointly produce can be thought of in this way. So first, the power of judgment. The power of judgment plays a role in bringing about all judgments, and I've noted already this distinction between the determining and reflecting, but I haven't really said anything yet about how these two ways of judging relate to each other. So the power of judgment, as I noted, is a higher cognitive faculty along with the understanding and reason. This is the second column in the chart. And so first, I want to just attend to what it means for something to be a higher cognitive faculty, because I actually think that this sheds light on the relationship between the determining and reflecting uses of the power of judgment. So for Kant, higher cognitive faculties are things that have their own a priori principle. And so accordingly, Kant will call them autonomous because they give themselves their own law rather than being given a law from without. So in the case of practical judgment, reason finds within itself the moral law and legislates this for the faculty of desire or the will. But of course, reason cannot apply its law on its own. This is, of course, where the power of judgment steps in. Kant invokes the power of judgment in the second critique to explain how it is that human beings can apply the moral law to specific situations. So while reason can yield or bring forth a universal, it is not able to specify how it is to relate to particular cases. And even though the power of judgment assists other faculties in applying their laws, it also has a law of its own. This is just what it means for it to be a higher faculty. What's interesting and important for our purposes, I think, is that Kant thinks that this is true of the power of judgment only in reflection. So Kant defines reflection in the third critique as the comparing and holding together of given representations. Just a side note, perhaps, about reflection. The notion of reflection appears in a variety of contexts within Kant's philosophy. It's involved in the generation of empirical concepts, aesthetic judgment. And I think it's somewhat of an open question how exactly reflection relates to reflecting judgment. And this is a bigger issue than I can deal with here, though I'm happy to discuss it in the discussion period. For the rest of the talk, what I just want to sort of operate on the assumption of is that reflection is in some sense an activity of the power of judgment. So I want to sort of bracket other kinds of questions about how exactly these things relate to each other and see the activity of reflection as in some sense an activity of the power of judgment. So notably, Kant says of reflection that it must be based, this is a quote I think on the handout as well, in a rule of the higher faculty of cognition, namely the power of judgment, which is thus legislative and demonstrates autonomy, he says. So it's only reflecting and not determining judgment that has its own special principle. Determining judgment always requires another faculty to provide a principle. And this is why Kant calls it heteronymous. This is a word that might be more familiar to us in the context of Kant's ethics, but Kant speaks of determining judgment as heteronymous because he says it operates only under laws of another faculty. It has no principle of its own, so it has no autonomy. And then he says it thus does not, in fact, properly belong to the power of judgment at all. So determining judgment fails to meet the criteria for being a higher cognitive faculty. And so I suggest that we think of determining judgment as in some sense arising from the activity of the reflecting power of judgment, working together with some other faculty, say in this case, reason, to apply its law. So we'll look at the faculty of reason. Kant defines reason in several different ways throughout the critical philosophy. It's the faculty of principles, it's the faculty of inference. It's also the faculty of deriving a particular from the universal. And I think the unifying idea here, at least for our purposes, is that reason allows us to arrive at something previously unknown on the basis of something known, which is why Kant associates it so closely with the syllogism. But what's perhaps most notable about Kant's remarks on syllogism is that he associates each of the three parts of a syllogism with one of the three higher cognitive faculties. Notably, the power of judgment is responsible for the minor premise, subsuming a particular under the condition of the rule, so that a conclusion can be drawn. This is because nothing could be deduced from a general rule or major premise alone. I couldn't, for example, state all human beings are mortal and then immediately conclude that Socrates is mortal, since I have not yet subsumed the term Socrates under the concept human being. Only following this subsumption, this mediating step, can reason infer that Socrates also goes with the term mortal. And so I think similarly in the practical case, I couldn't merely posit the categorical imperative or some abstract moral principle or rule, and then merely on the basis of this conclude what I ought to do in the particular situation that I find myself in. So again, a version of a point Kant makes in various places, simply possessing the adequate rule or maxim does not allow one simply to deduce what one ought to do in a given case. So there cannot be rules for the application of rules, and in this case, there cannot be principles for the application of principles. So Kant describes the practical syllogism, and this is a passage as well on the handout, as, quote, proceeding from the universal in the major premise through undertaking in a minor premise a subsumption of possible actions, again, language of possible actions here, as good or evil under the former, to the conclusion, namely the subjective determination of the will. So in any syllogism, the major premise states a general rule that a certain predicate applies to anything that meets a certain condition, whereas the minor premise states that this condition in fact applies to a certain something, in this case, a possible action. Kant defines practical principles at the outset of the second critique as propositions that contain a general determination of the will, so maxims, laws. In the minor premise of a practical judgment, a specific action is subsumed under either the concept of good and evil or evil. These are the two concepts of pure practical reason, which function as the condition of the rule stated in the major premise. To have a concept of an object of practical reason is to represent some object as the kind of thing that one could bring about through their will. In the minor premise, we say of some object we could bring about through our will, some action that we could perform, that it is or that would be good or evil. And finally, the conclusion of the practical syllogism states whether I should bring about the action, that is, whether the action is morally required or rationally necessary. So before moving on, I just want to quickly mention what I think is an interesting implication of this idea that practical judgments are determining for two related notions, determination and also subsumption. So first, it means that there's two distinct kinds of determining judgments, the theoretical and the practical. Why do I think this is important? I think that the second kind is almost always overlooked, though Kant makes a distinction on more than one occasion. The theoretical determining judgment, he says, represents what a thing is, while the practical determining judgment says that, quote, I, in order to produce a thing, ought to perform some action. So what's distinctive about the practical determining judgment is that we determine how to produce an object. As Kant says in the B preface to the first critique, it's concerned with, quote, making the object actual. Again, as opposed to determining something about some object that already exists in the world. And so this explains, I think, how practical judgment can be both determining and productive of its object. Relatedly, I think there's a distinct kind of subsumption that's going on in practical judgment. And like determination, subsumption, I think, is almost always equated with sort of first critique type judgments. But Kant invokes the notion of subsumption in the Typic section of the second critique as well. And we can say for now that whatever practical subsumption is of course not the subsumption of an already existing object under a concept, but rather that something that takes place in the production of the object. So turning now to reflection, what does it mean to say that practical judgments are reflecting? As early as the first critique in the Amphiboly section, Kant states that all judgments require reflection. However, most accounts of practical judgment that invoke reflection, Kantian or otherwise, see it as a kind of perception of the particularities of the situation. So when O'Neill rejects reflection as irrelevant for understanding practical judgment, she, I think, has in mind views like this. So McDowell, for example, says moral deliberation is the capacity to read the details of situations. And I think that this is certainly an important aspect of moral agency, even one that bears on the process of practical judgment. But the object of a practical judgment is that which we seek to bring about through action, not the background conditions of that action. And so to the extent that reflecting judgment is a matter of reflecting on a particular, it seems as if the particularities of my situation can't serve in this capacity in the relevant sense. Of course, O'Neill doesn't think that a possible action could count as a particular. As I've shown, Kant will speak of possible actions. That's something perhaps to discuss as well. But recall that reflection is a matter of, as Kant says, holding and comparing various representations up to each other. So Kant will describe practical judgment as the comparison of the maxim of my actions with a universal law of nature. And he will say that reason always holds the maxim of the will and an action up to the pure will. So in the terms that I've been using, in the minor premise of the practical syllogism, I hold up a possible action, some representation of an action that I could perform against the concepts of pure practical reason. A universal is given, but as we know, the rule itself cannot instruct me how to subsume. Reason provides the law, but the power of judgment is enlisted, you might say, to help reason apply that law, which is, I think, just another way of saying that even when judgment is determining, it's also always reflecting. Two things to conclude. First, in the chart, another thing that you might notice is that Kant links judgment and feeling. And I think the relationship between judgment and feeling for Kant is an interesting one, and there's a lot that could be said about it. Without getting into all of the details here, I just want to suggest something that I think this tells us about what's common to all judgment. Something like, I want to characterize it as kind of affective response to the holding up and comparing of various particulars and universals. So in reflecting, the power of judgment holds up and compares representations to each other and determines whether they belong together by means of feeling. This is the view, at least that I have, and I think that if this is right, there are a few upshots to this. First, it would provide a pretty straightforward way of understanding what Kant's solution to the regress problem is, the one that I invoked earlier, this problem generated by discursive rules. Namely, that it can only be stopped in some sense by non-discursive means. So as the faculty of applying rules that's not itself rule governed, judgment is in some sense guided by feeling. It also, I think, provides a degree of continuity between determining and reflecting judgment, which these might have seemed like very different activities of the mind, even though Kant puts them in one faculty, applying a universal to a particular versus searching or seeking out a universal for the particular. Of course, in reflecting on a particular in the absence of a universal, I have no other resources at my disposal for judging except the feeling that my response is appropriate to the object. But I don't think that this is any less the case in determining judgment. So the presence of a rule or universal, I don't think removes the necessity of reflecting judgment to still hold up and compare these representations to each other and respond to them effectively, judging whether they belong together or not. There can be no rule instructing me how to do this or how to subsume, whether or not to subsume. You might say, I just see or I feel that this representation, say an intuition or a possible action, belongs with this representation, a concept or a moral rule. Again, another way of thinking about what it means for judgment to be reflecting and determining. And then finally, I think that this would point to an interesting role for something like moral feeling. On the one hand, moral feeling usually is discussed in the literature with respect to the issue of moral motivation, and specifically the feeling of respect for the moral law. But if feeling is needed for the ability to make judgments about whether my representation of a possible action ought to be subsumed under the concept of moral goodness, then we can actually locate feeling much earlier in the process of moral agency. It doesn't just enter at the point at which I need to muster up the motivation to perform some action that's required, but rather as soon as we begin to determine what action is required. So then the cultivation of moral feeling on this picture wouldn't be limited to the moment where I need strength of will, but would actually include the capacity to improve my ability to discern the goodness of an action. And I think if this is right, then it gives us good reasons for rejecting the charge that Kant is this formalist whose ethics proceeds only from abstract rules and principles, devoid of emotion and feeling and the like. I'll conclude by just briefly noting what I think this means also for the relationship between practical judgment and practical reason. So the term practical reason tends to get used as kind of an umbrella term for all matters related to moral agency and deliberation and instrumental reasoning, so on. Kant, as we know, identifies the will with practical reason, and he does so, as he says, because, quote, reason is required for the derivation of actions from laws. But I want to kind of pick up on an ambiguity in the word action there between what we might call types or kinds of actions, for example, lying, and singular actions. So this lie that I could tell. So I want to suggest that we understand this distinction between practical judgment and practical reason in terms of a distinction between an act type and an act token. And I think Kant suggests a division of labor of this sort when he says the law can prescribe only the maxim of actions, not actions themselves. This is a sign that it leaves a playroom for free choice in following the law. That is, the law cannot specify precisely in what way one is to act and how much one is to do by the action from an end that is also a duty, end quote. So this question of leeway or latitude, I don't think it's primarily a question of what one's duty is, but rather how one is to fulfill one's duty. So the fact that lying is always wrong does not mean that the specific action I must take in order not to lie will always be apparent or uncontroversial in every case. And I think Kant connects this idea of leeway or latitude with the need for judgment when he says, ethics unavoidably leads to questions that call upon judgment to decide how a maxim is to be applied in particular cases, end quote. So reason on its own can tell us that a certain kind of action, an act type, is required or not. It does this by moving from the pure law, the concept of duty as such, to a maxim, a principle of duty or a concrete imperative. However, it cannot tell us which specific act token to perform. That is how to move from the maxim to a specific action. This, I think, is the purview of judgment. So without judgment, reason could never say anything more than that certain types of actions are good, which is to say that without judgment, reason would be incapable of being practical. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I'll clap for everybody. I think we have our technical issues sorted out, which is great. Thanks again to Rosalind for the handout. Now we'll turn it over to Jens Timmermann in the University of St. Andrews for some comments.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Nick, for a very rich and stimulating paper. And I think we're largely on the same page. There are many points of agreement. I think I agree with you that Honora O'Neill dismisses the disjunction a bit too quickly, and that possible objects or objects that are present in the imagination must be enough for judgment to work on, or maybe counterfactuals. But one theme that, as I read your paper, sort of kept showing up was whether there might be different kinds of practical judgment. And you say quite rightly that practical, I think from the groundwork onwards, most explicitly in the second critique and in the third critique and the first introduction, means moral for Kant. But there's also a broader notion of practical that you refer to from time to time. And there may be more than one kind of moral judgment. So I've got 4 points. I'll race through these 4 points. And I think the first and the fourth point are the crucial points for me. And the second and the third are points that you may want to pick up at a later stage for your bigger overall project. So my first question really is sort of core moral judgment. There are two versions of that. And the first is that we apply the categorical imperative in the singular, i.e. the moral law as we face it, to determine what we should do, right? So this is the familiar case of holding a candidate maxim up to the moral law, imagining what it would be like if everybody at all times subscribed to it, and so on and so forth. Basically groundwork, section 2, section 1 territory. But there is also, it seems to me, the slightly different question of once we have those results, right? Once we have moral laws in the plural, don't lie, be kind to other people, don't throw away your life, stuff like that. What happens then, right? So subsuming possible actions under those laws that we know, because we've done our work, however implicitly, that Kant talks about in those examples in the groundwork. Now, for the most part, it seems to me you talk about the second case, i.e. the case of our having moral laws, of which there are many, and we apply them to specific cases. For example, in what you said about the syllogism passage in the second critique, but you sometimes seem to be talking about the first thing, i.e. the CI procedure, as some people call it. For example, when you refer to the Typic, which I think is very close in spirit to the law of nature formulation. So question is, which one is it? Second point, again, you may want to ignore this for the time being. In a broader sense, of course, instrumental technical reason, hypothetical imperatives are a matter of practical judgment as well, because it's reason involved in bringing about objects. So it involves causal reasoning, as Kant tells us again and again, importing laws of nature for the most part into our will, making them practically relevant. But if we are to import laws from outside the will into the will to act on them, instrumental laws, in that case, I think the question is what kind of judgment is involved in that kind of process when as we judge that these are relevant for us, and not just theoretical options or theoretical connections that have no bearing on the will. We also need this, by the way, when we apply moral ends, right? If I want to be beneficent, I have to know how to do it. And that is not a moral question, it's a technical question. At least part of this discussion is about how best to act on hypothetical imperatives. Third point, and you mentioned this in passing, what about maxims? Maxims are practical principles. Maxims are applied to cases. Consider, for example, the way that the deposit case is described in Theory and Practice of the Second Critique. Someone says, someone's got the maxim of enlarging one's means, but one's wealth by all safe means. This is a case of my maxim, i.e. keeping the deposit that nobody knows about is a way of enlarging my fortune. That seems to be a kind of practical judgment. So maybe you could say a bit more about that at some stage. And fourthly, the second, I think, sort of substantive point to return to morality. I think you slightly overstate the gap between rule and application. And you're right, of course. Kant tells us in the first critique, in Theory and Practice, in the Critique of Judgment, and so on and so forth, that you need judgment to apply rules. But the gap can be bigger in some cases and pretty small, it seems to me, in other cases. In particular, I think the gap is not supposed to be that great when we turn to perfect or strict or maybe judicial duties. That is why in the Doctrine of Right, Kant says in the Metaphysics of Morals, there's no casuistry, there's no casuistical training, allegedly, despite what he says about lawyers in Theory and Practice. Once laws are clear and clearly formulated, no casuistry allegedly is needed, and you can sort of see how he would want this for what we these days call Rechtssicherheit, the rule of law, right? Some rules must be such that they are easily applied. In the case of lying that you mentioned, I think it's fairly straightforward, namely it's asserting something you don't believe to be true. Now, you need to know what an assertion is, and you need to know something about truth, so it's not completely straightforward, maybe, but it's supposed to be sufficiently straightforward for these rules to be really hard and fast rules that we can hold people accountable for following or violating. Relatedly, conscience, which is a kind of practical judgment or relates to practical judgment in some shape or form, is supposed to speak up if you're not sufficiently certain about the maxim you're about to act on, think inquisitor in the religion. So the fourth point really is, aren't some rules easily applied? And just as a footnote, I think on pretty much the same note, I think we need to distinguish very carefully, not just between the categorical imperative in the singular and categorical imperatives in the plural, but also between, on this note of the fourth point, perfect and imperfect duty. And different kinds of judgment may be involved in acting on perfect duties, maybe something slightly more straightforward, and on imperfect duties. And in the case of imperfect duties, of course, we can have conflicts or we can have clashes. I can have subsumed under the rule of self-perfection that I should do this, and under the rule of beneficence that I should do that. But I can't, given my circumstances in the world, I can't do both. And then I need to judge in some shape or form what's more pressing or what's more important in the present situation. And that's something that I think many people are interested in when they talk about practical judgment. So I think it would be nice if you could say a bit about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens. Nick, would you like to go right to questions or say something directly in response to some of that?
Sorry. So yeah, I'll just say one quick thing, and then in the interest of time, I suppose, open it up. Yeah, on the fourth point especially, I think I agree with you, and I think that's something I should take into account more. I guess even if so, maybe something that, at the risk of sounding trivial, talking about the gap between rules and their application, it seems like one point that Kant is making, or that I would sort of lean on a point that Kant is making here, is just to say that no matter how small the gap, the presence of a gap means there's always a need for judgment. And maybe this, there's such straightforward, or you might say like mechanical or just kind of boring instances of judgment that we don't even, they're not that philosophically interesting, and the ones where there's conflicts of duties and we have to make a practical judgment, there is a much more interesting case. I grant all of that. And I think there's, more that could be said, even to connect it to what I mentioned at the very outset, which is, those kinds of issues tend to take center stage in, people like Herman. Even O'Neill talks a lot about this kind of stuff as well. And so, one thing I've tried to do is just sort of say something about what I think is kind of a prior question about just like what practical judgment is. But you're right. And these are things I think I should acknowledge a bit more. And I think some of the same things would apply in the case of your first point, which is something like, are we dealing with the moral law, the one moral law? Are we dealing with multiple moral laws that are, downstream from that? And, I'm not sure, to be honest. Sometimes I do sort of go back and forth. And I suppose as well that I'm sometimes inclined to think when we're talking about practical judgment that there's not just one type. I mean, you're sort of inviting me to think about, are there different kinds of practical judgment? In talking about the sort of minor premise step, I was sort of also, just for the scope of this talk, focusing on one kind of clear case of practical judgment, what Kant also is talking about in the Typic, where I subsume a possible action under the concept of good, for example. But maybe there are other moments that would also be called practical judgment, and I wouldn't want to rule those out either and say that there's only one instance. But where the line is between that and something else that's maybe at a higher level of abstraction that might be called something like practical reason, as distinct from practical judgment, is also something I was kind of gesturing at. So
Thank you.
I'll leave it.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we heard a little bit from Nick about, and from Jens about the Typic. And so now we're going to have a talk that's focused on that general topic. This is actually, I should ask, Lara, have you managed to figure out the screen share?
Okay, let me try this. Alex has my slides in case that this doesn't work, but I just don't want him to work too much. I'm supposed to do this.
Let me just say, this is Lara Ostaric from Temple on
Hi,
Reflection and
everyone.
Imagination. Thank you. Yeah, welcome.
It says, Andrew, host disable participant screen sharing. So you need to enable that and then I'll try.
Oh, am I the host still?
You're the host, I think. That's what it says last time. No?
Yeah, you are, Andrew. I mean, you can hand it back over to me now if you'd like.
Meeting settings. Host controls. All right, I'm gonna drop out and that should make you officially the host, and then I'll come back. Maybe that's the best way to do it.
I think you can just.
Here we go. Here we go. Yeah. Alexander Engler.
Okay. All right. Lara, I'm gonna let's just see what happens if I make you the host, and now you can just share.
Okay.
And then there shouldn't be a problem anymore. So it's just, you are now it.
Yeah, I think I should be able to do that. Yep, I'm good. Okay. So you can see that, right? Can you see my screen? The slides? Yes,
looks great.
Okay, all right, it's working. So Alex, thank you, but I want to spare you extra work. I will try to move along. I'll read the paper and then try to alert you to the relevant parts in the power on the power slide. So the section of the Typic of pure practical judgment follows Kant's discussion of the concepts of an object of pure practical reason, namely the concepts of good and evil. The aim of the section is to account for the possibility of appraising, beurteilen, one's possible actions as falling under the concepts of the morally good or evil. So I wish to reiterate against other contemporary commentators that Kant's Typic is not about appraising actions in general, for example, someone else's past or possible actions, but possible actions that will be the outcome of my maxim, my principle of action. In this paper, I shall argue that the Typic is Kant's proposed answer to 1. So this is the outline on the slide in terms of what I want to argue. The general problem of practical judgment, namely the problem of the heterogeneity of representations similar to the one Kant addressed in the schematism section of theoretical judgment. And 2, the specific metaphysical problem of practical judgment, namely the problem that the object of the concept of the moral good cannot be given in sensible intuition. I shall further show that Kant's proposed solution to the problem of practical judgment, the solution that will make practical judgment possible, presupposes the use of 1, analogy, 2, what I believe is less controversial, transcendental reflection. I will further argue that this solution anticipates 3, what may be more controversial, the type of reflection Kant outlines in symbolic hypotyposis of reflective judgment in the 3rd critique. Finally, I should conclude the discussion by contending that even if, as Kant himself states, the law of nature as the type of the moral law is not the product of the synthesis of the imagination, the power of imagination maintains an important role in ensuring the possibility of practical judgment. Hence, 1, I'll address what the general, specific, or special problem, as he calls it, of practical judgment is. 2, the practical judgment and analogy. 3, practical judgment and reflection. And 4, practical judgment and imagination. So 1. All right. So before one can offer an interpretation of the Typic section, one must assess the problem to which Kant proposes a Typic as a solution. Kant contends that on your slide, that's the first quote, the judgment of pure practical reason is subject to the very same difficulties as that of pure theoretical reason, though the latter had means at hand of escaping from these difficulties, namely that with respect to its theoretical use, it depended upon intuitions to which pure concepts of the understanding could be applied. And such intuitions, though only of objects of the senses, can be given a priori, schemata, conformable with pure concepts of the understanding. Sorry, I need to admit somebody to the room. I'm the host now. End of quote. Thus, at the beginning of the Typic section, Kant directs us back to the schematism section of the Critique of Pure Reason. Unlike the deduction, which addresses the question of whether the categories apply to appearances, the schematism section addresses the question under what sensible conditions the categories of the understanding can apply to appearances. In other words, to know that the category of quantity applies to appearances in general is not the same as to know that the objects to which it applies must be, whatever, extensive magnitudes. Thus, the schematism section addresses the question of what must be the conditions for the successful exercise of the power of judgment, the power or the capacity of subsuming the particular under the universal or concept. As Kant states at the beginning of the schematism section, the conditions for the successful exercise of the power of judgment is homogeneity of representations. So that's the second quote on this slide at the bottom. In all subsumptions of an object under a concept, the representation of the former must be homogeneous with the latter. That is, the concept must contain that which is represented in the object that is to be subsumed under it. For that is just what is meant by the expression an object is contained under a concept. Thus, the empirical concept of a plate has homogeneity with the pure geometrical concept of a circle, for the roundness that is thought in the former can be intuited in the latter. End of quote. The difficulty of pure theoretical reason, however, is that that pure concepts of the understanding in comparison with empirical, indeed in general sensible intuitions, are entirely unhomogeneous and can never be encountered in any intuition. It is therefore hard to explain the possibility of subsumption of any particular intuition under the category, since the categories cannot be intuited through the sense and therefore not contained in appearance. Kant's solution to the above summarized difficulty of pure theoretical reason is, as he calls it, a third thing, which must stand in homogeneity with the category on the one hand and the appearance on the other, and makes possible the application of the former to the latter. End of quote. Furthermore, this mediating representation must be, as he says, pure without anything empirical and yet intellectual on the one hand and sensible on the other. Such a representation is the transcendental schema. Kant conceives of transcendental schemata as transcendental time determinations, which are on the one hand homogeneous with the categories insofar as they are universal and rest on an a priori rule. On the other hand, they're homogeneous with the appearance insofar as time is our a priori intuition that orders the manifold and therefore is contained, as he says, in every empirical representation of the manifold. End of quote. Thus, the transcendental schema of the category of realities being in time, substance, persistence of the real time, and so forth. Now, practical judgment, as I also say on this slide, and I provide the quote, shares the same problem of homogeneity of representations with theoretical judgment. On the one hand, we have the concepts of good and evil, which are grounded in the will determined by the moral law. And that's also the quote on your slide, the law of freedom in accordance with which the will is to be determinable independently of anything empirical, merely through the representation of a law in general and its form. End of quote. But on the other hand, we have possible concrete actions in the world, and quote again, all cases of possible actions that occur can be only empirical, that is belong to experience and nature, end of quote. These possible actions are to be appraised as either good or evil, that is subsumed under the concepts of good and evil. Thus, the general problem that practical judgments shares with theoretical is how the rules contained in the representations of the concepts of good and evil, namely the ones that are entirely a priori, can be identified as contained in concrete actions which are empirical and belong to the realm of appearances. But while theoretical judgment found a solution to its problem in schematism, practical judgment is, quote, subject to special difficulties. So I'm going to move to the slide on the so-called special problem of practical judgment. So the quote is on the page here. The morally good as an object is something supersensible, so that nothing corresponding to it can be found in any sensible intuition, end of quote. Thus, in addition to the problem of heterogeneity of representations, on the one hand, a priori rules independent of anything empirical, and on the other, the realm of empirical intuition, and how the former can be identified in the latter, there is an additional metaphysical difficulty. While determination of an a priori intuition schema served to mediate heterogeneity of representations in theoretical judgments, no such determination of an a priori intuition can be used in practical judgments, because no object of the concept of the morally good can be given in sensible intuition to which the form of pure intuition could apply. So Kant's proposed solution to the special difficulties of practical judgment. That's also on this slide, the second point. So Kant's proposed, but he says the prospects for practical judgment, he's very optimistic, continues Kant, are not hopeless, but favorable. Although practical judgment cannot avail itself of a schema, it has at its disposal a law. Such a law, however, I quote, as can be presented in concreto in objects of the senses and hence a law of nature, though only as to its form. This law is what the understanding can put under, unterlegen, an idea of reason on behalf of judgment, and we can accordingly call it the type of the moral law. So end of quote. So that's here also on your slide. Now, once the type of the moral law is generated, the agent compares, that's the sort of second step in the solution that Kant provides, vergleichen, one's own individual maxim with the universal law of nature, the type, in order to praise it, beurteilen. That is, in order to consider whether an action that would result from such a maxim could be subsumed under the concept of the moral good. We ask ourselves whether we could will to be a part of the world in which our subjective principle of action were to become a universal law of nature. Because the type, the universal law of nature, is not a schema, but it serves its function, we can call it a schema analog. The schema analog solves the problem of practical judgment insofar as considering a possible action in the world that will be the outcome of my maxim as if governed by the universal law of nature, shares the feature of universality with the moral law. Although it is unlike a transcendental schema insofar as it is not a product of an a priori determination of a pure intuition and hence does not belong to sensibility, it still makes a connection to the realm of appearances insofar as we are asked to represent our maxim as a universal law of nature, the world. Okay, so these are the steps of the proposed solution. So once we have the formation of the type, second is the comparison, comparing, and third is finally the subsumption or failure thereof. Now, I want to say that the formation of the typic presupposes the use of analogy. I will proceed to show that the formation of a type, right, the law of nature is a schema analog of the moral law, presupposes the use of analogy. Kant distinguishes between a qualitative and a quantitative analogy. So this is the quote on your slide here from the first critique, what the distinction is. In philosophy, analogies signify something very different from what they represent in mathematics. In the latter, there are formulas that assert the identity of two relations of magnitude and are always constitutive, so that if two members of the proportion are given, the third is also thereby given, can be constructed. In philosophy, however, analogy is not the identity of two quantitative, but of two qualitative relations, where from three given members I can cognize and give a priori only the relation to a fourth member, but not this fourth member itself. Although I have a rule for seeking it in experience and a mark for discovering it there, end of quote. So on your slide, the example of a quantitative mathematical analogy could be formulated as follows. So A is to B what B is to X, where A and B are given and X is a missing item. And qualitative philosophical analogy based on our knowledge of one qualitative relation. And when giving a third term, we can construct by analogy to the first relation a second relation, namely the one between the third and some unknown fourth term. Thus, an example of a qualitative analogy could be formulated as follows. So A is to B what C is to X. While by means of mathematical analogies, we can a priori cognize the characteristic features of the missing term, by means of philosophical analogies, the unknown term and its features cannot be cognized. Instead, we can merely refer to the rule by means of which the unknown member can be thought. So in what follows, I shall explain Kant's notion of qualitative analogy in more detail. In a footnote, so this is your new slide. In a footnote in paragraph 90 of the Critique of Judgment, Kant defines qualitative analogy as follows. This is the quote on your slide. An analogy in a qualitative sense is the identity of relation between grounds and consequences, causes and effects, insofar as the identity obtains in spite of the specific difference between the things or those of their properties that contain in themselves the ground for similar consequences, their difference outside of this relation. Thus, in comparing the artistic actions of animals with those of human beings, we conceive of the ground of the former, which we do not know, through the ground of similar effects in human reason, which we do know. And thus an analog of reason, and by that we also mean to indicate that the ground of the artistic capacity in animals designated as instinct is in fact specifically different from reason, but yet has a similar relation to the effect, comparing, say, construction by beavers with that by humans, end of quote. The rule of the relation in qualitative analogy is the one of cause and effect. This is not surprising given that causality is a category of relation. From the passage above, we can see that there are 4 elements in an analogical relation, and 3 of those 4 elements are known, while 1 is unknown. The qualitative analogy, in contrast to the quantitative analogy stated above, can be expressed as follows. So cause 1 to effect 1 is what cause 2 is to effect 2, which is also on your slide. Thus, regardless of the fact that the entities compared, beavers and humans in the example above, have different properties, the rational causality in humans and its effects, artifacts, has an identical relation as the one between causality in beavers, that is their construction, and its effects, beaver dams. The formation of the analogical relation begins with the observation of the similarities of effects. In the example given above, the observed similarity is between the functionality of beaver dams and the functionality of human artifacts. The analogy then moves from the observed effects, the beaver dams in beavers and artifacts in human beings, to the known cause of human rational agency, to finally the unknown nature of the causality in beavers. From here, we cannot infer that the nature of the causality in beavers, the unknown cause, is that of a rational agency, but we can think of their causality as an analog of reason. Why does Kant contend that by means of analogy we can think or represent the causality in animals as rational, yet we cannot infer that they're rational? With respect to the example above, the following type of inference would be possible. Okay, I'll read this. I don't have it on your slide, but I'll read the quote. Yet from the comparison of the similar mode of operation in the animals, the ground for which we cannot immediately perceive, to that of humans of which we are immediately aware, we can quite properly infer in accordance with the analogy that the animals also act in accordance with representations and are not, as Descartes would have it, machines. And that in spite of their specific difference, they're still of the same genus as human beings, as living beings. The principle that authorizes such an inference lies in the fact that we have the same ground for counting animals with respect to the determination in question as members of the same genus, insofar as we compare them with one another externally on the basis of their actions. There is par ratio. So that's end of quote. This is from paragraph 90 in the footnote of the critique of judgment. So the principle of equal reason, par ratio, authorizes us to infer that animals act in accordance with representations. Put differently, we're authorized to make this inference because we have the same ground or reason for counting human beings and animals to belong to the same genus, namely the genus of living beings. We can conclude that they belong to the same genus based on their externally observed properties, that is their actions. Because animals, just like human beings, belong to the same genus of living beings, they must act in accordance with representations, just as human beings do. This, however, does not allow us to infer that the type of action in accordance with representation is the same as the one in humans, namely rational. The principle for making this inference is missing. That is, we do not have the principle of equal reason to claim that beavers belong to the same species as human beings or that beavers are humans. Although we cannot infer that the causality of animals is rational based on analogy, we can think of their causality or represent it as if it were rational. So now back to practical judgment on your slide. Let us now consider to what extent the formation of a type in practical judgment presupposes a mediation of analogy. First, let us consider the general formula of a qualitative philosophical analogy. A to B is what C is to X. We could take B in this formula to stand for causality of the law of nature and A to stand for perceptions of happenings, events in nature. We can take X to stand for the moral law and C to stand for the will. The rules governing the relation of the two pairs are similar. The law of nature determines the perceptions of happenings in the world, similar to the way the moral law determines the will, that is, with universality and necessity. This gives us the license to substitute the law of nature for the moral law. In other words, it gives us a license to use the law of nature as an intuition, i.e. a schema analog, for the concept that cannot have its own intuition because it cannot have a corresponding object in empirical reality, namely the concept of the absolute causality of transcendental freedom. The next step required by practical judgment is the comparison of the maxim of possible action with the universal law of nature that serves as a type of the moral law. The agent must ask herself, I quote, whether if the action they propose were to take place by a law of the nature of which they were themselves a part, they could indeed regard it as possible through their will. Thus, if the possible action through my maxim, for example, I am allowed to deceive others whenever it is to my advantage, becomes subject to the universal law of nature, I represent to myself the world in which everyone permitted himself to deceive when he believed it to be to his advantage. I cannot possibly will to be a part of this world in which one would not be able to tell the distinction between truthfulness and deception. Finally, after this consideration, I cannot subsume the possible action which would result from my maxim under the concept of the moral good, because my possible action did not share the common features of universality and necessity that is presupposed in the moral good. Now to the next topic, the typic and reflection. The next question that must be addressed is whether there is room for reflection and or reflective judgment in the formation of the typic. Okay, I'm here a little bit. So I'm claiming that we can at least in uncontroversial way argue that transcendental reflection must be necessary aspect of practical judgment. And when I wrote that, I thought maybe I wrote that too hasty because now that we heard Nick's presentation, Honora O'Neill does not think that any form of reflection pertains to practical judgment, simply because she doesn't think that practical judgment can belong to anything as a regular notion of judgment in Kant, simply because what we're working on are not given particulars, but possible actions. And that kind of raises the whole question of what it means for Kant to be given. And I'm here sort of siding with Jens and also with Nick. I think that for Kant to be given means to be given in sensibility. And that sensibility, or to be given in intuition, and that intuition doesn't necessarily have to be an empirical intuition. So I think that practical judgments are clear from that perspective. So I think we can say that transcendental reflection, right, in contrast to logical reflection, refers to the comparison of given representation with one's faculty of cognition. It is, as Kant formulates this in the Amphibole chapter, the first critique, I quote, the reflection, the action through which I make the comparison of representations in general with the cognitive power in which they're situated, and through which I distinguish whether they're to be compared to one another as belonging to the pure understanding or to pure intuition, end of quote. Thus, transcendental reflection is a comparison of representation that is sensitive to the origin of their content, that is, whether the content is pure or empirical, whether it belongs to understanding or sensibility, in order to even establish the heterogeneity of representation between, on the one hand, the idea of the moral good, and on the other, the concept of pure action in the world, possible action in the world, there must be a transcendental reflection that establishes the former as having a priori origins, and the latter as belonging to the realm of appearances, and hence as having empirical origins. What is more controversial is whether the typic presupposes, in addition to transcendental reflection, the type of reflection Kant discusses in indirect or symbolic hypotyposis in the third critique. So this is sort of the second point on your slide here. The most common objection to the latter view is that this view entails anachronism, and we'll maybe hear more about that from Adam, namely that the concept of reflective judgment was not available to Kant in 1785, and the proponents of this view presumably project the third critique back to the second. However, even if the principle purposiveness is hence the conception of reflective judgment was not available to Kant in 1785, we should be able to identify some aspects of the Typic that anticipate Kant's discussion of the role of reflection in symbolic and indirect exhibition of the ideas of reason in the third critique. Let us be reminded of Kant's discussion of judgment's double task in indirect or symbolic presentation of ideas in the third critique. In an analogical or symbolic presentation of a concept, writes Kant, the power of judgment, this is a quote, performs a double task. This is also on your slide. First, applying the concept to the object of sensible intuition, and then second, applying the mere rule of reflection on that intuition to an entirely different object, to which the first is only the symbol, end of quote. We can see that both tasks of judgment are recognizable in the formation of a type. Thus, in the formation of a type, so this is the third point of your slide, the first task of the power of judgment is to apply the concept of causality of the law of nature to our perceptions of something that happens. The outcome of this is that our perception of something that happens in the world is determined by the law of nature with universality and necessity. I don't think I mentioned this. I mean, Kant is not really clear what he has in mind by the law of nature. And I think he has in mind the kind of efficient causality that is the subject of the second analogy in the first critique. The second task of the power of judgment is to take this rule that governs the relation of actions, events in the world, namely the universal law of nature, and to place it under, unterlegen, the concept of the moral law, which does not have a corresponding intuition. It is licensed to do that because the moral law determines the will with the same universality and necessity as the law of nature determines our perceptions of that which happens in the world. The next question is whether this double task of judgment in the formation of a type should be assigned to determinative or reflective judgment. And this is the next slide. It will be difficult to assign or argue the latter, namely reflective judgment, the double task of judgment requires in the formation of a type. So I'm arguing what we have here is reflection, but not reflective judgment. This is because if we look at the distinction, it was the quote already provided by Nick, but I'm going to read it here again. It's the first quote on your slide. The power of judgment in general is the faculty for thinking of the particulars contained under the universal. If the universal, the rule, the principle, the law is given, then the power of judgment which subsumes the particular under it is determining. If, however, only the particular is given for which the universal is to be found, then the power of judgment is merely reflecting. End of quote. To say that for reflective judgment, the particular is given and the universal must be found refers to the fact that the particular remains underdetermined by the lawfulness of the understanding and hence requires the principle purposiveness to be employed by reflective judgment. These particulars that remain underdetermined, as argued in the third critique, are beautiful forms of art and nature, organisms and natural ends, the relation of particular empirical laws. But in the formation of a type, the particular happenings in nature are determined by the resources of the understanding, the universal law of nature, the efficient mechanical causality. But in the first introduction to the third critique, Kant defines reflection in general as follows. So this is the second quote, which I think may save the problem here. To reflect, to consider, however, is to compare and to hold together given representations either with others or with one's faculty of cognition in relation to a concept thereby made possible. End of quote. In the example of symbolic or indirect presentation of a concept, the judgment compares the representations of two different objects. One of the objects is given in empirical intuition, perceptions of happenings in the world, and the other object is the object of an idea that is not given empirical intuition. The moral law. The judgment compares the representation of the given particular object, events in the world, and the representation of the object that is not given an empirical reality, determination of the will by the moral law. It subsumes the connection of particular events in nature under the rule of mechanical causality, the universal law of nature. In the comparison of two representations, the concept of commonality is generated between the effect of the known rule of mechanical causality and the effect of the unknown cause, the moral law, on the will. Given this commonality, we can think or represent the unknown causality, the moral law, as if it were the known causality, the mechanical causality of the universal law of nature. Only once a type is generated and furthermore comparison made between one's individual maxim and the law of nature can the act of subsumption of my possible action under the concept of the moral good take place. So basically reflection, yes, but reflective judgment, no. And the final section is Kant's Typic and imagination. So the final controversial issue, I'm sure there are more, but these are the ones that I picked, to be addressed is whether the power of imagination is relevant for Kant's Typic. Commentators tend to deny any role to imagination in the Typic based on what Kant himself says in this section of the second critique quote. And this is the quote that is on your slide, the first one. Thus, the moral law has no cognitive faculty other than the understanding, not the imagination, by means of which it can be applied to objects of nature. And what the understanding can put under an idea of reason is not a schema of sensibility, but a law. This law is what the understanding can put under an idea of reason on behalf of judgment. The passage I contend should be read as Kant's attempt to remind us that a type is not a schema. A transcendental schema of the concepts of the understanding, I quote, is in itself always only a product of the imagination. End of quote. More specifically, the transcendental schema of the pure concepts of the understanding requires the pure synthesis of the power of imagination in accordance with the rule of unity specified by the category and which enables the termination of inner sense, time. Thus, the imagination interprets the data of pure sensible intuition, time, as instantiating the rule thought in the concept. When it comes to the schema of empirical concepts, the imagination follows the rule specified in the concept, the dog as a four-footed animal, and interprets the sensible data given in perception as instantiating the rule contained in the concept without being restricted, as he says, to any single particular shape that experience offers, end of quote. In the Typic, there is no role for the imagination that would involve a direct connection between the rule contained in the concept and intuition, whether pure a priori intuition or empirical intuition. The type, the law of nature, is not the product of the synthesis of the imagination. This, however, does not mean that there is no room for a significant role of the imagination in practical judgment. If we remind ourselves that the understanding is the faculty of rules and that judgment is the faculty of subsuming under rules, the rule of the concepts, then neither the understanding nor the faculty of judgment are responsible for the recognitional capacity of interpreting that the rule contained in the moral law is homogeneous with the law of nature, or in other words, that the law of nature is a suitable type for the moral law, or that we can regard the moral law as if it were the law of nature. Thus, I contend that any form of analogical exhibition of a concept requires the interpretive faculty of the imagination, more precisely requires the productive imagination, which is governed by the, he says in Lectures on Metaphysics, law of compatibles, according to which one must make sense of what fits together. In other words, in any analogical exhibition, the imagination must interpret the content of sensibility, the law of nature and its relation to our perceptions of happenings, with a view of its suitability for serving as a schema analog for the moral law. Moreover, the second step of the Typic requires of me to compare my own maxim with a type, namely the law of nature. In other words, it requires of me to imagine the world in which my own maxim will become the law of nature. Imagination is, defines the Kant, a faculty for representing an object even without its presence in intuitions. That's in the first critique. Thus, the world in which everyone is permitted to deceive when their advantage does not exist and is not given to mean empirical, intuition. However, when comparing my maxim to the law of nature, I'm asked to represent such a world, even if this world does not exist. This can only be done by means of imagination. So that's it. I mean, to sum up, right, for Kant, as Nick already says, all judgments require reflection, but to practical judgment, reflection may even be more fundamental than it is to other judgments. This is evident from the formation of an analogical relation that is necessary for the production of a type. This does not entail that practical judgment is a form of reflective judgment. And although reflection is fundamental to it, practical judgment ultimately subsumes my possible action, the particular, under the available rule given by reason, the moral good. Finally, we can also acknowledge the importance of the imagination for practical judgment without being guilty of, as Adam has argued, aestheticizing it, that is, assimilating the nature of practical judgment to the one of aesthetic judgment. That's it. I think I went a little bit over time. I apologize.
Thanks, Lara. Could you take down the screen share?
Yep.
And then Adam for comments.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Lara. I'm happy to see the Typic discussed. I think it's a fascinating and quintessentially Kantian passage, all of this brilliance and difficulties you can find in those 4 pages. So
what we didn't
pleasure.
get, at least what I didn't get to discuss is, what's the overall position of Kant's Typic in his second critique. That's a different story. And maybe we'll get to that in the discussion, but that's a completely different than what it is that the issue is supposed to solve particularly.
Right. And yeah, so I mean, the comments, I'll just go quickly and informally because it's tricky for me to comment on it because I wrote the book on this thing, so I don't want to go on and on. I think in terms of the problem that the Typic is meant to solve, I think you've correctly, diagnosed it. It is sort of the second critique's equivalent of the schematism. So you have this heterogeneity problem, which takes on this particularly thorny form because you're dealing with a supersensible law of nature instead of just a pure category of the understanding. And indeed, the solution that's proposed is some sort of analog of a schema. It can't be a schema because it can't be an intuition. So it has to be something else that plays that mediating role, right? So it's this mediating representation. Totally agree with that. And all of this is to permit a certain subsumption, right? Subsumption of actions under these concepts of the morally good and evil, which are explained in the previous chapter. I think the part that I was most sympathetic to, and I thought was interesting also in relation to Nicholas's talk, is this idea of transcendental reflection being necessary to elaborate the Typic, because it is a beautiful example of reflection at the transcendental level of saying, okay, we have these different types of representations that come from different faculties. How are we going to put them together? And you can sort of see Kant going through his conceptual toolbox to come up with something that will fit them together and mediate. And so to see the Typic as an example of transcendental reflection, I think makes a lot of sense. The question I would ask you is, later you talk about faculty as an interpretive faculty, but I would ask what faculty, according to you, is doing transcendental reflection, right? Is it the imagination? Is it something else? Is a faculty necessary? Anyway, so what's going on with transcendental reflection? And then in terms of reflective judgment in the double task and symbolic hypotyposis, as I argued in my book, I think that the more apt comparison is between the Typic and symbolic anthropomorphism, which is described in the Prolegomena, which comes before the Typic. And As for symbolic hypotyposis, if the typic were a precursor to it, or prefiguration of it, one would expect to see it mentioned in the third critique, which it is not. And I think that, just as I take it, the specific nature of the typic does not require symbolic hypotyposis to be brought out. And I think symbolic hypotyposis functions very differently from the typic. Just to briefly justify that, if you look at an example of symbolization through symbolic hypotyposis, classic example is the despot's handmill, where it's a bottom-up process, right? So it's grounded in intuition, it's grounded in sensibility, where you're looking at something like this handmill going, and and it's present to you through the imagination, etc. And through sort of scrutinizing that and reflecting on it, you extract a very specific kind of causality that's at work there, which is, this external crank, which is making the gears turn passively. And as more you reflect on it, the more that becomes specific. And then once you have that, that's the first part of the, doppeltes Geschäft. And once you have that very specific kind of causality, then you can use that and transfer it to something more abstract that you want to symbolize, like a despotic state. And then you say, oh, well, the relation of the subjects to the despot is analogous, right? And can therefore be symbolized by the handmill, because it's like they're being passively ground and churned by this external force. And so it's this bottom-up process to symbolize something more abstract. And I think it's an interesting concept. Whereas in the typic, we already have the moral law. The understanding already generates the law of nature in its pure form, right? That's already there. It's a very top-down process. And then once you have the law of nature, right, in its pure form, then the imagination can go ahead and schematize it in whatever way it wants, to generate that thought experiment or whatever. The law of nature has what he calls aesthetic universality. In other words, it can be illustrated by anything, right? Like a rock falling or a billiard table. It's not about specific causality there. So I see them working in very different ways. So that would just be my objection, I suppose. And so for the commonality, right? You say that the concept of commonality is generated by the imagination. Definitely in the case of symbolic hypotyposis, we're recognizing a commonality, an unexpected and interesting one between the handmill and despotic state. Whereas in the typic, the commonality is presupposed. He says, Gesetze als solche sind einerlei, right? Laws as such are the same. They're both universal, neither admit of exceptions. And that's what justifies, using the law of nature as the type of the moral law. So again, I would see it working in the other way. Imagination is not completely excluded, because it's necessary to schematize the law of nature and to generate this thought experiment. But I wouldn't see it as necessary in that sort of reflective sense. So so those are just my quick comments. But again, I'm interested to hear your response.
Thanks. I should have said in introducing you that you are a professor at Collège Bois-de-Boulogne, and you have written the book on the typic in the Kant-Studien Ergänzungsheft.
Right.
So thank you very much for doing this. Lara, would you like to respond?
Yeah. So I would respond to the first point. So why not symbolic hypotyposis as being here, the connection between the type and what he discusses later in the third critique. And yes, he does mention symbol in the typic section as well. And I remember reading also in your book, you says, okay, this is just kind of accidental that he mentions it. And I'm kind of like, I don't see it's an accident. He's a pretty careful guy there. When it comes to these fundamental terms, symbol can't be an accident that he uses it there. But when you say, there's this specific causality in the mill example, and then we move from that causality to the thinking of a despotic state, what I think you mean by the specific causality is more the relation of parts to the whole, which is the subject and objective of the third critique. So when he thinks about mechanical causality, he no longer thinks about, either the second analogy mechanism or the kind of mechanism that we have in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, where he thinks about the motions of bodies in general. See, he has a third kind of mechanism in mind, which is the relation of parts to whole. And the reason why he has it, because now in the third critique, he has this problem, right? But there are certain kinds of forms and objects in nature that the reasons of the understanding can't just simply account for. We cannot really make them represent them as lawful, right? So he has that story to tell, and he needs to start from parts to whole notion of mechanism. But that doesn't seem the reason why we should now say, okay, when he talks about the typic as being some kind of, symbolic hypotyposis, is not really something similar to what he has in the third critique. It's just a different kind of mechanical causality that he has in the second critique that is really not present in the third critique. And the reason, it seems to me, is simple, right? I mean, actions, right? Human actions are ultimately part of appearances in the real world. So he can think about them as being part of appearances, that he can think about them as being subject as other perceptions of happenings in the world, which is subjected to the second analogy. So that kind of thought of mechanism and efficient causality is more the focus of the typic, rather than the parts to whole relation, which is a symbolic hypotyposis in the third critique. But that's the only difference that I see between the two. Now, what I read in your book, right, you think one of the reasons why you seem to be resisting that we shouldn't be reading symbolic hypotyposis too close to the typic is this fear of aestheticization of practical judgment. And I have sympathies. I'm very sympathetic to that. I certainly don't want to aestheticize practical judgment, not even in, Hannah Ginsburg Wittgensteinian sense, right? Where, there is this primitive normativity, but really we can't really spell out what the rule is. I mean, for Kant, there is a rule and there is a law and there is a norm and we know it and we have it. So I don't want to go that way. But, and I agree with you on that one, but I think what for Nick was the feeling, that's what for me is the imagination. And that's kind of the last part of the paper, which I kind of ran out of time and ran out of space. But I think for me, what really explains that recognitional capacity is the power of imagination, the power to interpret that the particular really contains the rule contained in the universal, right? So just to give an example from, extended family, right? You have two doctors. One, sees the particular case in front of him as a case for a liver transplant. The other one sees it not as a good case for a liver transplant. Both of them are completely in possession of the universal. If you ask them, what qualifies a liver cancer as a good liver transplant, they'll give you the rules. So they have the understanding. They both have equal exposure. I mean, they're mid-career doctors, yet one of them must be wrong and the other one is right. So my inclination is not to say, okay, one has the feeling and the other one doesn't. I wouldn't, because that, I'm afraid, goes more towards that either Wittgensteinization of Kant or aestheticization of practical judgment, neither of which I want to pursue. But I'm like, let's look at, Kant's own faculty and resources for that. And there is imagination. So one of them has a developed, recognitional interpretive capacity that the other one doesn't. Not that will make it easier on me, because once you get into the power of imagination, you're likely to get yourself in a mire that you can never really get out of. But I think, it's worth trying. That's what it is. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you.